we can see it.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, apologies, everyone. I'm here at my campus office, and for some reason the internet is down. So I am using Wi-Fi on my laptop, and so hopefully the connection will be adequate for that purpose. So let's begin. All right. So today I want to comment on two arguments that purport to give some evidence in favor of theism over metaphysical naturalism. These are not the most common theistic arguments, nor even the ones that I myself find most compelling. But I chose them because they are somewhat neglected by philosophers, and I think they are not always developed in the best way. And so I want to use them to illustrate the general framework that I am proposing for comparing theism and naturalism. So typically the considerations that these arguments focus on, human and animal consciousness and the existence of norms and values, are put forward as completely at odds with naturalism, that is, as strictly incompatible with naturalism. Whereas I think they should be framed more modestly in terms of comparative theoretical advantage. They are features that easily fit within the framework of theism, while fitting less well, perhaps, within metaphysical naturalism. They are bits of evidence that need to be considered alongside the full range of possible evidence when seeking to make a judgment concerning which theory is better overall. Okay, so let me adjust something here on my laptop. Good. So more than 30 years ago, philosophers Richard Swinburne and Robert Adams put forth an argument for theism, which they label the argument from consciousness. A basic sketch of the argument goes like this. There are facts involving systematic correlations between the brain states and the conscious states of human persons which call for explanation. There are only two broad forms such a possible explanation may take. The correlations can be explained either through more basic scientific laws or by reference to the intentions and actions of a powerful personal agent. Okay. Since the correlations cannot, the argument goes, since the correlations cannot be given an adequate scientific explanation, the only available form of explanation, excuse me, is that they were established in some way by a purposeful agent. Since there is obviously no candidate natural agent to have set up the correlations, then the agent must be supernatural, and most plausibly God. So the nature of human and animal consciousness is a matter of major inquiry and debate in both philosophy and in neuroscience itself. Nearly everyone agrees that the peculiarly subjective qualitative character of conscious states poses a significant challenge to materialism, the claim that all the fundamental features of our world are material, physical, and all non-fundamental features are wholly constituted by those fundamental features. And nearly everyone also agrees that neuroscience gives us strong reason to believe that the conscious states of creatures like ourselves causally depend upon the neural states of their functioning brains and nervous systems. For every conscious state, there must be one or more brain states with which it is correlated. So I will have the experience of seeing a red tomato, for example, if and only if there is a corresponding state in the visual cortex portion of my brain, or one of a limited range of possible states in my brain capable of supporting such an experience. But correlation, strict correlation, is not the same as identity. Simply to say that brain states, conscious states, are correlated with brain states is not to say that they are identical. And there are familiar thought experiments that suggest that there cannot be such a physical conscious state identity. So consider Mary. In an argument that has been much discussed in philosophy, first put forward by the Australian philosopher Frank Jackson, we imagine Mary being a person who has lived her entire life from infancy forward in a black and white environment, a kind of monochrome environment, just shades of gray, right? Perhaps her parents were psychologists and chose to raise her this way as a lifelong psychological experiment or some such thing, right? But Mary becomes an expert in the neuroscience of color vision, even though she herself has never experienced color. So she knows exactly, and now we imagine a future neuroscience which learns all the physical facts that underlie color experience. So Mary, looking through her black and white computer, right, can see information about the neural state of a person who's being scanned while they're having an experience of some color, right? And she can know what type of state this person is in, right? At least the neural state, and she can even know what terms are used to describe that state, that the person will say, oh, that's the experience of a blue sky, right? But she herself has never experienced blue. Now, we suppose one day she escapes from her black and white environment and walks outside and immediately sees a bright red rose. And then the thought is she learns something about color experience. Indeed, she learns the most crucial thing about color experience, what it's like to have an experience, what it's like to see red, right? That was something that, although she knew all the physical facts that were correlated with experiences like that, she knew nothing about the experience itself, its intrinsic nature. Okay. Now all of a sudden the menu option for clicking forward to the next slide is not. Okay, there it is. So you can look at that argument. That sort of summarizes Jackson's argument for the falsity of materialism, that the physical states cannot be themselves conscious states. And so it's an argument for what is known as dualism. There are two fundamental kinds of states in our world: physical states of various kinds, including physical states of the brain, and conscious experiential states. All right, so this dualism of physical and conscious states is highly disputed, of course. It's one of the oldest debates in philosophy. So Swinburne and Adams, their argument is relying on a much disputed data point, right? Namely the non-identity of conscious and physical brain states. And since Swinburne and Adams formulated their argument from consciousness to theism, neuroscience has undergone significant development. There are now 4 programmatic neuroscientific proposals concerning the nature of consciousness, and studies underway that are attempting to marshal evidence to decide between them. Well, along with other dualists, I find these frameworks as offering at best accounts of the neural underpinnings of consciousness. They're not plausible as accounts of what consciousness is. Now, naturalism does not entail materialism. So a naturalist does not have to be a materialist. But a naturalist, of course, who also accepts materialism will reject the dualist assumption that fuels the argument from consciousness to theism. Well, we can't settle that very large issue here, but suppose, for the sake of argument, that our naturalist agrees that dualism is more plausible. How exactly does the argument go from there to theism? Swinburne and Adams both argue that there can be no systematic, scientific, or natural connection between physical properties and conscious or phenomenal or experiential qualities, what are sometimes simply referred to as qualia, the qualities of experience, the looks and sounds and odors and so on. They both argue that there can be no systematic connection between physical properties and qualia that would explain why they are correlated in the particular patterns that they are. Why this kind of brain state is correlated with that kind of conscious experience, and this other kind of brain state is correlated with this other kind of conscious experience. They argue there can be no explanation of the correlations. Since an explanation of some sort is required, and the prospect for a naturalistic explanation is not very good, a theistic design-style explanation, they say, is the most plausible remaining option. God simply set things up in such a way that when brains are properly configured, when you have creatures, not only human beings, but also animals, then they would systematically have experiences of a given kind. But it's a kind of arbitrary correlation instituted by God, right? It could have been hooked up in a different kind of way. It could have been that the very same kind of brain state might have given rise to a different type of conscious state. All right, well, even restricting our attention to human experiencers, there are a huge variety of actual and possible phenomenal states on the one hand, and neuronal state configurations in relevant portions of the brain on the other. Present science knows a great deal about neurons, the basic elements of the brain's architecture, and about some of the mechanisms of communication between neurons. Now, much is still unknown about the relevant structure types of complex structures that subserve psychological operations, right, within ourselves. But no one doubts that a systematic neuroscientific theory is there to be had. We might naturally conjecture that a mature scientific classification of phenomenal qualities of consciousness would similarly identify the fundamental phenomenal properties and relations and specify a corresponding combinatorial algorithm for them, right? So the idea is, yeah, we have very complex conscious states, but if you break down, imagine your visual field, you're looking at your screen and you're seeing bits of color and patterns arranged in different sizes, and the thought is a mature science of consciousness would zero in on the little elements of your conscious experience and come up with an inventory of basic quality types, little bits of color, little pure sound elements, something like that, and then begin to learn how these things combine into overall experiences. And then the thought is we could hope to identify general laws of physical neural, that is in the brain, phenomenal covariation. All right, well, Swinburne dismisses the possibility of any such simplifying account on the grounds that phenomenal qualities are not quantifiable. You can't measure them, which is a central characteristic of scientific laws. However, it is plausible that qualia exhibit geometrical relations, right? My objects are in vision are laid out in a visual space, and they admit of variations of degree of similarity and difference, of intensity. Colors come in degrees of intensity, even experientially, of extent, size, how much of the visual field they take up, and so on. So there do seem to be mathematical qualities to the qualities of our experience. Their essentially private or subjective nature may preclude being able to measure them exactly as a practical matter. But the argument from consciousness concerns the in-principle availability of a naturalistic explanation of correlations, not the practical feasibility of doing this. But for his part, Adams allows that qualia may admit quantifiable descriptions, but he believes that two insuperable obstacles to a scientific account of consciousness remain. First, he says, it is not plausible that any kind of phenomenal properties correlate with anything other than highly structured neural states. They don't correlate with even simple phenomenal properties. They don't correlate with simple physical or neural properties. They correlate with complex states in the brain, or at least states that bear relevant functional similarities to neural states. And hypothesized law, then, would at most chart the relationships between basic phenomenal qualities and certain physically complex kinds, rather than similarly basic physical kinds, right? So you're going to have, the laws are going to say, when you have very complex physical state like this, you get simple phenomenal quality like that, okay? And as Adams sees it, such a law would merely describe rather than really explain an important fact needing explanation, namely that phenomenal qualities are correlated with specifically neural states and not with other physical states, whether simple or complex. Why are they even correlated with neural states as opposed to the complex physical state of my bookshelf, right? Which at a microphysical level is very complex. The second obstacle to a scientific explanation of conscious experience, he expresses this way, as I have it on the screen. You can read that there for yourself. All right. Well, Adams is correct, I think, that these two considerations preclude a certain type of explanation, a type of explanation that we are accustomed to seeing science pursue and often achieve. But they do not preclude any form of explanation whatsoever. The form of explanation that these difficulties preclude is a reductive and maximally unified explanation. Our most general science, which is comprised of the different branches of fundamental physics, has achieved great success toward the goal of a highly unified science of the elementary causes structuring the universe. It's an open empirical question whether a maximally unified theory might be possible, right? Where you boiled fundamental matter down to say a single element, right? A single type of particle or superstring or whatever physics might dream up, and a single dynamical law that governs the covariation of different instances of that type of thing over time. So suppose a theory of this sort is not attainable, right? Right now we have fundamental particle physics posits something like 20 distinct particle types, right? Suppose it just bottoms out there, or it stops at 13, right? Well, if so, then we would say that those particles and the equations that govern their interaction would provide the deepest explanation of the universe's dynamics. And of course, it will be scientifically unexplained why the universe is ultimately composed of those sort of particles rather than some other sorts, or none at all. But that's a different question. And that's the subject of a different sort of theistic argument, the so-called cosmological argument. So, admitting primitive phenomenal qualities that causally interact with certain kinds of structured physical states is also to give up the aspiration for maximal theoretical unification in our explanatory account of the world, how it unfolds. It means that there are properties that are emergent in a robust ontological sense. That meaning that they are irreducible to more basic physical qualities, and there will be correspondingly irreducible laws that chart their connections to physical reality in the ongoing evolution of physical systems. So it's going to be not a maximally unified account. But the naturalist may say that's just a surprising fact about our world, that bits of matter carry within them, you might say, the potential, when organized in certain stable, complex configurations, to give rise to conscious beings who experience a range of phenomenal states. Does the availability of such a naturalist reply mean that the argument from consciousness is altogether worthless? So the naturalist reply I'm envisioning, which accepts a fundamental dualism of phenomenal properties and physical properties, will say, well, we still can integrate in principle. We could have a scientific theory that explains what kinds of physical configurations give rise to specific types of phenomenal states, and how those phenomenal states in turn impact the physical evolution of the world. It's got a certain complexity to it that we can't get rid of, right? But that might be true even at a fundamental physical level. We might have some degree of complexity in a final purely physical theory. That doesn't mean there's no explanation. It just means that the unification of the world, the story, the theory for the world, is not as simple as we could imagine might be possible. That's all it means. All right, so does this make the argument from consciousness altogether worthless? In my view, such a negative verdict would be too hasty. There is something here suited to a design style argument. It's just that Swinburne and Adams have not characterized it properly. I have suggested that dualists may reasonably suppose the existence of basic general laws connecting neural state types and families of phenomenal state types. Such laws will encode facts about specific dispositions of fundamental physical particles to generate emergent features only in special context. Here is where I see the potential for design style reasoning. So I want to rethink the argument from consciousness, give it a different form. It seems plausible that there are a variety of ways that things might have been with respect to the fundamental constituents of the world. There might have been ever so many different sorts of entities having different sorts of basic dispositions from the ones that are manifested in our world. So instead of electrons, there might have been schmectrons, some other kind of particle that had just a different character from the character of negatively charged electrons in our world, right? There's nothing special about electrons and neutrons and so on that make them, and quarks, make them to be the only possible building blocks of a physical world. The sky is the limit, as we say. So in particular, it seems a priori, that is prior to experience, rather unlikely that fundamental physical entities should have any emergent dispositions towards giving rise to phenomenal qualities only in complex situations. That seems really unlikely, that you should have a world like that with these little entities having this disposition only when structured in certain ways to suddenly giving rise to a new kind of quality altogether. That this is unlikely is suggested by the fact that many philosophers judge the emergentist view to be utterly implausible for our own world, right? And some are even tempted to say it's outright impossible that there should be emergence like that. So we may put the point this way. Among the epistemically possible worlds in which naturalism is true, you say, what are the possible ways you could have a purely natural reality? We would expect that relatively few of them would have fundamental particles or whatnot with the surprising tendency, when highly organized, to generate new and ontologically fundamental states, and states furthermore that are valuable, right? We take states of experiential states to be particularly valuable kinds of states. By contrast, the emergence of consciousness seems more likely, conditional on theism, okay? So emergence then is more evidence, is some kind of evidence for theism. It's reasonable to think that at least one of the highly valuable goods that a purposive world designer would wish to see in his creation are creatures, persons capable of learning about the world through perception and gradual accumulation of knowledge, who have an ability to make a difference to many aspects of their lives and the lives of others, and who have free will to choose which differences, good or bad, to make. We would expect God to populate his creation with fundamental physical properties that are rich enough to lead to the emergence of just such beings. So taken this way, the peculiarity of consciousness in a world that is physical at its bottom contributes to the evidence base for the modern so-called fine-tuning argument for theism. Okay, so I'm now linking the argument from consciousness to this other argument that has emerged in since the 1970s, because it draws upon some things that have been learned only in recent physics. So this fine-tuning argument, so please bear with me, I'll very quickly kind of summarize what that argument's about, and then make clear why I see this argument from consciousness as an aspect of that more general argument. So the fine-tuning argument is rooted in a vast range of information that comes from cosmology and fundamental physics. Physicists in recent decades have documented dozens of fundamental respects in which our universe is, at least according to present theory, is exquisitely fine-tuned for the eventual appearance of biological, and so intelligent and sentient biological life. What is meant by the neutral term fine-tuned is that there are apparently contingent features of the universe involving such things as the precise ratios of different basic particles, right, or forces, or the very specific value of certain very large numerical constants, numbers that show up in dynamical laws, such that had those ratios been ever so slightly different, or had those numbers that are needed to state fundamental dynamical laws, had those numbers been tweaked just slightly, right? Like you have Planck's constant, 10 to the minus 34th or 35th power, very, 1 over 10 followed by 34 or 35 zeros, this very precise constant, this number. If you just took off one of those zeros, right, or even made less of a change of it, then according to physics, the universe could not then have unfolded in a way that is consistent with the eventual appearance of biological life. Everything has to be just so, it turns out, very surprisingly, at a fundamental physical life level, in order for biology as we know it, or even any kind of imaginable life, not just biology, not just life of the carbon-based sort that our life, any kind of chemistry-based life, right, that we can even imagine, depends on physics being set up in a very precise way. Well, these details have been documented in several places. You can read about it. There's a great deal of discussion of this in contemporary physical theory. All right, so the fine-tuning argument for theism then goes as you see on your screen. You think of all the possible variations on the fine-tuned constants, changing those numbers and all the different, 10 to the minus 34th, 10 to the minus 33.9, 10 to the minus, 30, a whole range as specifying a space of possibilities. They seem arbitrary. So on the assumption that our world just exists by chance, the naturalist assumption, right, you would think, well, there could have been a universe with Planck's constant, there could have been a universe with a slightly different factor, there could have been a universe with different ratios of particles. These represent a vast, not literally infinite, but very large finite space of possible ways things could have been. And then physics tells us that those possibilities, in that vast space of possibilities, those possibilities which are capable of sustaining any kind of chemically based life occupy an incredibly tiny portion of this space. If you think of it as a line that stretches out for miles and miles and miles, with every point on the line representing a distinct, change of one of those numbers, the life-sustaining portion is just tiny. That the one realized possibility happens to fall into this tiny yet highly significant portion of the possibility space is, you might say, suspicious enough as to lead us to seek an explanation. It looks like, right? Again, were God to exist, we would expect him, looking at the space of possibilities, to choose to create a universe that falls within that tiny range, that is set up just as needed to give rise to such a valuable outcome as sentient life. So the fine-tuning data then is more to be expected on theism than on naturalism. So you can represent it formally. You'll see that little equation on the screen. Just read that as the probability of fine-tuning given /theism is greater than the probability of fine-tuning given naturalism. It's more to be expected. It's not as surprising that our world should be fine-tuned in this way. If theism is true, it is surprising. It's much less likely a priori that it should be true if naturalism is true. So then the argument proceeds, assuming further that the existence of God is not as improbable prior to the consideration of fine-tuning as the very improbable existence of the universe itself on a pure chance hypothesis, well then the facts of fine-tuning indicate that theism should be judged more likely than naturalism. So notice 7, we've got the values there inverted. So now we're saying it now follows that given that fine-tuning is more likely on theism, then given the assumption 6, then by an application of so-called Bayes' theorem, you can infer that the probability of theism given fine-tuning is greater than the probability of naturalism on fine-tuning. Now, it's not my purpose here to assess the overall cogency of this design style argument. which has been the subject of a large debate. I'm going to simply suggest that the argument from consciousness is best developed as adding to the data of fine-tuning from a different domain. Since we said, right, that there being physical stuff having the potentially to generate emergent conscious states is implausible on naturalism, or it's at least surprising, and it's less surprising on theism. That's just one more bit of data that adds to this fine-tuning argument. All right, I'm going to have to move quickly here. I was going to ask, might the emergence of persons also in a certain way challenge theism, but I'm going to press on. I'm going to leave that alone. All right, argument from normativity. Many people have sensed that moral obligation has to flow from a transcendent source. As the character of the famous Russian writer Dostoevsky put it, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. There is no obligation if God does not exist. Yet many philosophers have dismissed the idea that there is any deep connection between God and morality. They commonly cite a dilemma that it was expressed in the ancient Greek philosopher Plato's Euthyphro dialogue, where Socrates asks Euthyphro, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious actions, right? Or is it pious simply because it is loved by the gods? Transposed into a monotheistic framework, you might say the question becomes this, what you have on your screen. Is what is morally good commanded by God because it is morally good? Or is it morally good simply because it is commanded by God? It's then argued that the second option, which makes moral goodness depend on God, is unsatisfactory because it would make morality arbitrary. What if God had commanded the torture of babies? The thought is, that's just it's not good simply because God commands it. It has to be that if God commands something, it's something it's intrinsically good, or it's good in accordance with an external standard of evaluation. Well, in my judgment, this is not a very compelling argument against a theistic basis of morality, and philosophers who continue to trot out this argument as if it were decisive need to think a little more deeply about theistic metaphysics. Plato believed that morality had an objective, non-arbitrary foundation in what he called the form of the good, this standard that transcends all worldly standards, such as human social conventions or the commands of the Greek gods, who often disagreed with each other. Monotheists agree with Plato about the objectivity of morality, but the God of monotheism corresponds not to the limited Greek gods in Greek cosmology who inhabit the cosmos, but instead the God of monotheism corresponds to Plato, precisely to Plato's form of the good. Monotheism is, you might say, a theory about the nature of the form of the good. In contrast to Plato, it's a view that the form of the good is a personal reality, that is the creative source of all things outside himself. And moral norms and obligations, facts about what we ought to do or ought not to do, are constituted by the commands of precisely such a God who is goodness itself. If you want to see this view worked out in great detail by a very good philosopher, see Robert Adams' book, Finite and Infinite Goods. Okay, theists can coherently suppose this, let's assume, but why think that the existence of moral norms and obligations uniquely point toward such a theistic account of morality? Cannot the naturalist offer a different account of morality rooted in her own metaphysical framework? Well, perhaps, but it is hard for a naturalist to give a fully satisfying account of moral norms. Clearly, the basis of morality is not going to arise from basic physics. All right? Now, the natural suggestion instead is that moral obligation is socially grounded. It reflects the attempts of members of a society to coordinate their actions in a way that benefits all or most of them, right? However, the flaws that we find in every set of societal demands, right, in every society that we know of, we see flaws in their conception of morality, right? And there are conflicts between societies, right? All of this seems to push us toward a more transcendent and stable source of moral demand. That which particular societal demands are faltering attempts to realize. All right, in my first lecture, I noted that for naturalist accounts of norms and values, there were three basic options: eliminate, reduce, or accept as fundamental. In the Q&A, someone correctly pointed out a fourth option, which you have there now on your screen. Hold that the meaning of moral statements is not what it seems to be. It's not actually to represent the objective moral facts. Instead, moral statements, properly understood, simply express distinctive attitudes or commitments of the speaker toward a situation. Fair enough. That is an avenue, a way of thinking about morality to which some naturalists have been attracted. However, there are also well-known problems with those kind of non-cognitivist accounts of moral language. I can't get into that here. And it seems that some naturalists are drawn to this option, not because they find it just the natural thing to think about moral language, but instead because of the difficulty for naturalism to accommodate straightforwardly objective morality. Furthermore, it is important to realize that norms are not just moral in character, there are also epistemic norms that govern good reasoning and theorizing, right? These kinds of norms are obviously central to the practice of science and of philosophical reflection on science. If we think science gives us objective truth or, pursuit of truth, then we have to suppose that the norms that govern scientific activity are themselves objectively true norms. Eliminativism or non-cognitivism with respect to these norms threatens to undermine any worldview built on science, including naturalism itself. All right, I'm going to try to very quickly here, almost got started a few minutes late. All right, so for this reason, I think the most plausible response for the naturalist is simply to accept the fundamentality of values and norms alongside the physical. So as a result, we're going to have a fundamental duality or maybe plurality of kinds of fundamental truth. All right, and that's what the naturalist could say that. You've got physical reality, and then you've got the reality of norm and value that's not grounded in physical reality, it's just sort of there alongside of it. So is that still naturalism? Well, it's a kind of weakened naturalism, okay? Well, I noted in my first lecture that other things being equal, theories that are able to unify more phenomena are to be preferred. Again, it was that attitude that it was that belief that unification is crucial to good theorizing that led to this statement by the biologist Dobzhansky about the theory of evolution, that it unifies the variety and location of species and fossils, the patterns that we see when we compare the anatomy of different species and compare them genetically. And the thought is, without that unifying theory, these are just a bunch of independent facts that just have to be treated as basic. Okay, well, theism has a great deal of power to unify our understanding of reality. On theism, foundational being is personal, knowing and willing, and creative, the sustaining source of all else. So this candidate for foundational being appears well suited to ground not only, the existence of physical reality, but also value by being the good and the beautiful that we see in limited ways in our lives. And God's commands are the ultimate source of our obligation to one another. Now, how we come to know about God's commands is a different matter altogether. There's more to say, but we're really running out of time here, about thinking about God's commands as being the source of moral obligation. There are a number of questions. Again, I refer you to Robert Adams' book to kind of see how this view might be worked out in some detail, but it does not have to be a simplistic, we need to look for some text, religious text, whether it be the Bible, the Quran, or whatnot, where God simply lays out a number of commands, and then we just say, okay, it's our job to do it, right? Morality, right? Thoughtful moral behavior requires deep moral reflection, and it's possible to think of God's commands as coming to human beings in a variety of ways, right? Imperfect ways, such that we do have to develop moral competence in order to properly fulfill those commands. All right. Let's see here. And finally, I'll just add that theism also has the potential to ground the eternal truths of mathematics and logic. Why? Because God is an infinite, eternal knower. The truths can be thoughts of God, as St. Augustine argued long ago. And so the upshot is that theism has the potential resource to provide one unified foundation for a fine-tuned cosmos that is ordered in the ancient formula by beauty, goodness, and truth. And such unifying explanatory power is significant evidence of truth. All right, I will end there. Sorry to have gone a bit long, but we can now have discussion.